Welcome, this is Stephen Violi from the Psychology Webinar Group, and tonight we have Kevin O'Brien, and as you would have heard in the podcast, Kevin kind of cut his teeth in domestic violence a little bit, so he has definitely had a lot of experience. He's got 20 years experience in the field of counselling and deals a lot with domestic violence, so this is a topic tonight which is of particular interest to Kevin and a lot of our followers out there. So I will go ahead and introduce myself. Hi, I'm Stephen, as I've already said, and I'm your host for this evening. We will have 15 minutes of question and answer time toward the end, and I will introduce Kevin. Welcome, Kevin. How are you going?
I'm great, and how are you guys? You going well?
Really well, thanks. Really well. So, could you give us a little bit of a deeper introduction? Actually, I should have fixed this slide. This is from an older bio of yours, but it's 20 years experience.
Yeah. Like you said, I've got 20 years experience, but mainly in relation to family and domestic violence. I started off in the agency called Anglicare WA, and I ended up working for the Changing Tracks program. And I ended up working for an organised part of that program was also men's time counselling, and specifically working with a lot of men who perpetrate violence in the home and violence outside of the home as well. And so not only dealing with family and domestic violence, there was a lot of community violence as well. And that was for mandated and volunteer clients. Now, what I mean by mandated is that these guys were, the term is court ordered, so they've gone to court for their behaviour, and the judge is saying you need to do a certain program. And Changing Tracks at one time was the preferred program. And volunteer simply means that they've done some counselling, identified that their behaviour needs a lot of work or it's not okay. And so they engage in what was the 18-week program. In the 18 weeks, we worked clinically intensively with these guys in terms of with the goal that they identify that their behaviour is not okay, moving towards change, and that's the goal. And so that's principally my experience with domestic violence, about 5, maybe 6 years in total. But as a youth worker and as a mentor, and subsequent as a counsellor working in private practice and working for other agencies, I come across this phenomenon, and I say it's a phenomenon because it's quite an alarming thing that's happening in our community, and you come across it time and time again. And one of the tracks, or one of the things that have been tracked through all this, is now that we've got a generation of boys perpetrating, not only boys but girls as well, but more so boys perpetrating violence in the home against mum. So they've been in the domestic violence situation, now they're perpetrating violence, and we've seen a lot of that in recent time coming through. So I bring to you that perspective, the uniqueness of that, and I'll just throw in some other bits and pieces as well to make it interesting. Okay, so we go on to the next slide.
Awesome. All right. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Always.
There we go.
I think we go straight into it now. So we need to understand what domestic violence is, because often we can leave with the impression that domestic violence are those who perpetrate violence, so physical violence. We could leave it there, but we wouldn't do domestic violence or family and domestic violence any justice. And it's more than just the hitting. So it can be sexual, and sexual is taking liberty to force your partner into sex, forcing her to do something. I just want to clarify something. I actually am going to be focusing on male behaviour, simply because if you take it globally, and all the violent crimes that happen globally, from what I understand, 90% of that is perpetrated by men. So if you break it down into Australia, it's quite an alarming statistic that men are the main contributor to violence in our community. So it's really important that I'm not singling out that men are this. It's just that it's just a certain population of men perpetrate a lot of violence. Do women commit family and domestic violence? Yeah, it's been reported, but it's not as high as men. I just wanted to clarify that. So going back to the sexual stuff, it's really about forcing someone to do something that they're not comfortable with or don't want to do. It can be psychological damage. The term uses mind games, so constantly making people feel on edge and psychologically abusing them. Forced socialization simply means that just removal from family, removal from friends, not allowed to go out, have to give an account for everything they do outside of the home. Economic deprivation simply means that you're on an income and that's all you're going to get and don't spend it on anything else. While on the other hand, the male or the other person has liberty with the finances and do what they like. And behaviour that causes the victim to live in fear, reckless driving, looks and intimidation, all that sort of stuff. It's threatening behaviour, but not actually following it through. So that even of itself is quite limiting in defining family and domestic violence. But it's a good start, especially for those who are learning about counselling or for those learning about working with people. It's really quite a good definition and a good start to sort of make you think and unpack what else could be family and domestic violence. So it's just a beginning to unpack that for you. Cool. Next slide. So the term is usually used where abuse or violence takes place in a relationship, including intimate partner relationships, same-sex relationships, between siblings, from adolescents to parents or family carers, to relative or relative with a disability. So, you put the word family on top of that, and it's whatever constitutes family, and whoever plays a part in the family. So obviously, if it's an Indigenous community, that can get really complicated. So I'm not an expert in Indigenous issues, so I'm not going there today. But from what I understand about the kinship system, it can present with significant complications if you're not trained in that area. So my suggestion to you, if you're not trained to deal with Indigenous issues, don't go there. Always try and find someone to do that. Okay, cool. Next slide. Characteristics of family and domestic violence is the use of violence or other forms of abuse to control someone with whom the perpetrator has an intimate or family relationship. So this is why men sort of become like the main focus, because in the statistics and all the evidence that goes to the courts and everything like that, it's men who tend to perpetrate the violence. And so there's many reasons, but if we make excuses for the violence, saying it's because of my ADHD, or if it's because of this, or it's because of that, then it sort of absorbs the perpetrator of the violence. And so if we've got to be careful that we don't say, well, it's because I've got a short temper, or it's because I've got my alcohol or my drugs, it made me do it. We can't buy into that. It's the attitude, because, for example, if that same person goes to work, would they demonstrate that behaviour in the workplace? 9 times out of 10, it's a big no. I wouldn't do that because I would get sacked. So there is control over things, but essentially it's about the attitude of the individual towards their family members. So it could be just simply a poor attitude choice that I can do this because I'm entitled to it, and we call that male privilege. And hopefully I can unpack that a little bit more for you later on. So we're really not looking for excuses for why they do that. Violence is not okay, and it's really the person's attitude towards violence that we need to explore and unpack and everything like that. So hopefully I've sort of made that clear. But please, if you've got questions, just send them through, and I'll try and unpack that a little bit better. But we really want to focus on men who perpetrate violence. We really want to get them to focus on their attitude towards that, and we want to make them reflect and think deeply around how their behaviour affects other people. So we really want them to get in touch with empathy. When I yell and scream because of whatever, how is that affecting my relationships with those close to me? Cool. So hopefully that's okay. All right. Cool. Next slide. So the term domestic violence usually refers to abuse against an intimate partner, while family violence, so domestic violence is usually the one-on-one stuff, wife, husband, partner, that sort of thing. While family violence is a broader expression encompassing domestic violence and the abuse of children, the elderly, and other family members. So often when we think of domestic violence, I don't think children or other people generally get lumped into that. Like when you hear about it, you just think, oh, it's just those two are at it again. And unfortunately, what we don't understand is that even though the children, for example, are in the other room, so to speak, they can still hear the yelling and the screaming. So they can still hear the abuse, the verbal, the bad language, or the threatening behaviour. They can actually hear things being broken. So all that hearing creates a fear for the child, and that would very much affect the development of the child's brain and overall development of learning and all that sort of stuff. Has a what's the word I'm looking for? Detrimental impact on their development, let alone anything else that's going on in the family. So we just need to be really, really mindful that if you are going to be working in the field of domestic violence, it's not necessarily the act that's happened between the two. It's the ripple effect, if I can use that analogy. It's the ripple effect that happens in the family. So when dad comes home and he's drunk and he beats up mum, that's bad enough as it is, but then there's this ripple effect to the children. They may have seen it, they hear it, and it's that we need to be thinking about as well when we're working with domestic violence. But also, when you're working with perpetrators of domestic violence, what's really, really important when we go for the empathy line is that we need them to start thinking about how their behaviour impacts on their relationship with their children, and get them to think and reflect on their attitude towards that. Because most dads want a really good relationship with their children. They really want this really nice, workable, collegial friendship, this whole really good relationship with their dad. And the dad want that with their children. We get that. But they need to understand that when they yell and scream, or that when they come home drunk, or when they're intoxicated with drugs, or when they do these extremely dangerous controlling behaviours, that affects the relationship. And so if they value that relationship, surely then that must be able to salvage that somehow in order to change behaviour, to elicit a better type of relationship for them. Cool. All right, next slide, if I can. Thanks. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people generally prefer to use the term family violence. So again, I'm not going to go into the complexities of that, but just putting it out there. This concept describes a matrix of harmful, violent, and aggressive behaviours. However, the use of the term family violence should not obscure the fact that Aboriginal women and children bear the brunt of family violence. So that's about as far as I'm willing to go, I think, on the issue of Indigenous issues around this stuff. But again, it's just that awareness. People use different terms for different things, and Aboriginal people have their own language and their own terminology, their own way of relating to these sort of things, or defining these things for themselves, I should say, sorry. And it's important that we listen to that and we learn from that, because our language, if you're a white Aussie, trained in all the things that we do, we have a certain language and style about us. And Aboriginal people, from what I've experienced and what I understand, have their own way of dealing with things, and we need to understand, respect, and maybe even learn from that as well. Cool. All right, next slide, please. Awesome. So we're going to break it down, but before I go into this thing, I've got a little bit of a non-PowerPoint, I hope that's okay, thing here about domestic violence. It's a couple of points that I want to sort of talk to the group about. Number one is that we've got to understand that domestic violence is a social problem based and perpetrated by existing societal attitudes and social relations, which reflect gender inequality and promote male privilege over women. Now that can be quite hard to accept, but what is male privilege? And I think a great way of giving an example of male privilege is simply that I might go to a concert by myself, and I can do all the things that I need to do and go home and be relatively safe with that. Where a lone woman or a lone female walking to the same concert doing the same things could easily get harassed and picked on. Like there's an assumption because she's a woman, she's a target, but because I'm a guy, I'm not. Then that's a societal sort of perception on the gender inequality there. So male privilege is the fact that I'm male, I can do whatever I like. I've got the strength and I can determine lots of different things, and it's really quite an interesting thing. I haven't got a lot of time to. That's probably a whole lesson on its own about male privilege. But the thing is because we're still hanging on to some old values around men have a lot of power and women still are quite subservient in a way. And that's changing, and I'm thankful for that in a way because I believe that's an erroneous viewpoint. But so it's really, really important that we understand that. Sorry. Domestic violence in majority of cases is perpetrated on men. I've sort of made that point. We acknowledge that occasionally a man may live in fear of his female partner, and that similar behaviours may be perpetrated in same-sex relationships. Same-sex relationships, again, it's a speciality. It's sort of like you've got to know what you're getting involved in and know what you're talking about. You've got to be trained to do that. So again, I'm not trained in that field, so I'm sort of going to just mention it. And then if you're interested in working with same-sex couples that do experience domestic violence, then maybe it's something that you need to talk to your organisation supervisor or look for some PD on that. Okay, so domestic violence is not an outcome of individual pathology, deviance, or personal deficit. Again, it's sort of like we're not making excuses. Just because you got something going on in your life doesn't mean that you perpetrate violence, because another person with the same thing doesn't do it. And so it's really about attitude, it's really about social responsibility. Domestic violence is not relational, that is, the abuses are not a result of relationship problems. Women and children have the right to live safely and safely and free, fear within their own homes, and access to services that support them. Women and children who are victims of abuse or violence are not passive recipients. Overtly or covertly, their responses represent resistance to the abuse. And I might, if I've got time, sort of touch on that a little bit later on. There is more perpetrators of abuse than the abuse he perpetrates. Men who abuse family members are not proud of the abuse they perpetrate. And domestic violence is the sole responsibility of the perpetrator. It is not a mutual process in which the victim of the abuse may be held partially accountable. So those last 2 points, when I work with men, especially in the group stuff, when you get to that point of talking about this, there's actually a greater sense of shame and a lot of disbelief around what they've done, and that disbelief is just to avoid the responsibility and a little bit about minimizing the abuse. And so most men, I should say, I shouldn't generalize too much, but most men will not be happy about talking about the abuse because it reflects poorly on them and they feel really embarrassed or a lot of shame around that. And second point is that the perpetrator of violence is responsible 100%. The woman is not responsible in a domestic violence situation. He controls his behaviour like everybody else has to control their behaviour. He is responsible for what he does in that moment. So if he chooses these things, he is totally responsible for them. And no amount of excuse is going to make that better. The only thing that's going to make that better is honesty and him owning his behaviour and making choices around that. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. So can we just go back up, sorry? Yeah, thank you. So physical assault occurs. So I've sort of talked about that. There's some examples there: pushing, slapping, punching, choking, and kicking. Sexual assault, we sort of touched on that a bit as well. So forced sexual contact activity. Forced in the context refers to the individual who are physically coerced to participate or who are not in a position to say no as a result of fear, threats, or intimidation. So if you want to know more information, there's the Sexual Assault Resource Centre website there, but there's probably other websites where you are or other agencies that probably define that a little bit better than what I can. Also contains more detail, so yeah, absolutely. Verbal threats, so threats, put-downs, insulting, and shouting. So can we go to the next slide? So we've got emotional and psychological abuse, mind games, manipulation, humiliation, making the person feel worthless or no good. Social isolation, we sort of touched on that, keeping the victim away from friends, family, work, or other social opportunities. Financial abuse, controlling the money and the decisions around its use, taking or limiting money, stealing. Spiritual abuse, keeping someone away from their places of worship or forcing them to participate in a spiritual religious practice they do not want to be involved in. I'll just get a drink, hang on. Cool. All right. So we've got these really clear definitions on what can occur. And now, in counselling, if you do have a person who is a victim of domestic violence, one thing we've got to be really careful about is that we don't make them feel guilty, or we don't make them feel responsible for what's happened. But what we need to do in counselling is really work hard into establishing some sort of empowerment for them, that they, and be really sensitive around how that's going to look. The term we try and use is resistance. So what are they doing in a way that's resisting in the domestic violence? Look for things that they're doing already that we would consider called resistance in that, and work with them and support them in that process of resistance. And so hopefully we can unpack that a bit. If you're working with a perpetrator, you really got to get them to understand that what they're doing is not okay, that it is actually damaging their relationship that they somehow care about, maybe, that it's a damage in the relationship with their kids, and it's not actually doing any benefits for them, because in the day they could actually get a criminal record, or they could lose out of their family, could end up in a divorce situation. They could lose a lot of things if they don't actually start taking the line of understanding how their behaviour, their choice of behaviour, is actually impacting on a relationship. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? So, this is called this is the cycle of violence. And so basically, an organisation called Duluth in Minnesota in the States, United States of America, they come up with these. They do a lot of research, a lot of work in the area of domestic violence, and they come up with these wheels. Now, these wheels need to be used in extreme cautions, because sometimes these wheels probably won't suit a situation. I've got a couple of the wheels here that I'm going to be looking through. But this gives you an idea. It's not the be-all and end-all, but just if you're starting out in counselling and you are starting out working with domestic violence or victims and survivors of domestic violence, then we need to understand that there is a pattern to the abuse. There is things that happen for people, but it's not. This isn't like the golden egg. This isn't like this happens for everybody. This is an example of what might occur, how she might feel. So it's just an example, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So the batterer, like the acute explosion moment. So they've had the big explosion. Sorry, and there might be some of these examples being used here. There might be humiliation. There might be imprisonment, beatings. There might be choking, all that sort of stuff. And in her response to that, she might have called the police. She might have tried to fight back, and that. So that's the moment that's happened. So what we've got to be really mindful of is that there will be like a remorse phase, or what's called the honeymoon phase here. And so often the batterer would try and, because what happens now, there's this massive distance between the relationship. So she's actually going off on distancing herself. She's removed herself from the situation, or she's just not communicating, or something like that. The morning after, he's getting up and she's going, oh, what have I done, sort of thing. And so what they'll try and do, the batterer will try and reduce the distance, this emotional distance or this physical distance, to get her back into, or get back in her good book, so to speak. And he will say he's sorry, or he'll ask for forgiveness, or he'll do a whole list of things. That she may do some of this stuff. She may agree to stay or return. She may want to stop the legal proceedings. Maybe there's a restraining order in place and all that sort of stuff. She may agree to set up counselling for him. She will take responsibility for it, unfortunately. And so if you're working with a victim of domestic violence, what we need to be really mindful is that she might actually then start taking responsibility for the relationship. We need to sort of educate them that that's probably not the best way to go. What we need to do is work, if you can, if it's in your scope to do so. The batterer needs to take responsibility, or the perpetrator needs to take responsibility. It's not for her to take responsibility. She's done nothing wrong, all right? And we can't say, oh, you need to do this, this, and this, and that to her, because that would be absolutely unethical. What we need to do with the perpetrator is go, look, mate, this is your behaviour. You need to take ownership, and we need to see you take ownership. You need to be accountable, and the process would be maybe through counselling, maybe through group work, where he starts to learn to understand his behaviour, take responsibilities for behaviour, get a good attitude around that, and then start making genuine progress, genuine change. authentic change is probably the words that we would use. We need to see better word. We need to see. We'll get there. We need to see demonstrated change. So it's okay. It's one thing to say sorry, but we need to see you demonstrate that through behavioural changes. And there's no way that we would get the victim to ever be responsible for that, because it's not her responsibility, it's the perpetrator's responsibility. Now, if it all goes well there, it ought to end there, but, wisdom always says that maybe there is some things that are going on and they do come back together again. So tension's building. It's called walking on eggshells. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon, this eggshell walking experience for people. It gets to this point where he's gone through the sorry phase and he's gone back to his normal behaviour. And she's now feeling like, oh my goodness, what's going on? I feel like he's going to do that. Now, what I come to understand in my experience is that she actually may, and this is not all the time, I've only heard this a couple of times, so it's not, this is more anecdotal than anything else. She actually may provoke the situation to get through the walking on eggshells, to get through the tension, because the explosion for her may be better than the tension that she's experiencing in this phase. So the reality, again, it's about the perpetrator being responsible for his moodiness. It's not her fault that he's moody. It's not his fault, not her fault, sorry, that he's drinking or doing drugs. It's not her fault that, crazy making behaviour or is threatening or yelling or putting you down. This is all him. And so she's just resisting. So there's some resistance in here. She might, for the sake of, for the kids and for the sake of her own family, protecting her own family, she might actually just stay away because that's resisting. She might actually, she might try and cook his favourite dinner in terms of, resistance. So like, I'm resisting you, I'm not giving in to you, but I'm just going to go through this process. So the term of resistance is quite here. She might remain silent as a term of resistance and all this sort of stuff. So there's lots of things that women do in these moments that might not be overt in terms of defending themselves or resisting the violence that's occurring for them. But they might do these really, really subvert things that we just probably not quite conscious of, that they're actually showing resistance to his behaviour. So in counselling, the resistance is what you need to look for from her, saying, well, how are you resisting this? How are you resisting your partner's abusive behaviour? And for the batterer, saying, where's your responsibility in all this? How are you taking responsibility? How is your behaviour in all this? When are you going to take responsibility? When are you going to choose a better behaviour? Most of the time, a lot of the time, every time, it is about choice. Like I said, he could come home and yell and scream at his wife, but go to work and he may be the really nice guy and things happen, but he won't yell and scream like he would yell and scream at his wife. So it really is a choice coming down to that. Hopefully that's been helpful. Hopefully that's been clear. Cool. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the parent control wheel. So this is another wheel, but it's not the be all and end all, and it's just an idea that you can have a look at and go, oh yeah, okay, now I understand, or this is what I'm witnessing in counselling, or this is what she's saying. All right, because 9 times out of 10, or most of the time, women do. You'll get more truth out of a woman in terms of domestic violence than you will out of the man. All right, so that's just something to be mindful of. So when you're counselling a victim of domestic violence, these are the things that she will say, and these are things, okay, so how can we help you in this regard? And if it's the perpetrator of domestic violence, we'll then say, well, you're doing this. Are you aware how this is affecting behaviours in the family, how it's affecting behaviour with children, and so forth. So the perpetrator will use intimidation. So that actually by making her afraid by using looks, gestures. He might smash things, he might destroy a property, abusing pets and displaying weapons. So, that's something that you need to be mindful of and make a judgment call, talk to your supervisor if you need to do anything else. Because you're all bound by ethics, you're all bound by agency policies and procedures, and the wonderful phrase called duty of care. We're all bound by that, so if someone's in immediate harm, I'm hoping and I'm assuming you know what to do. I don't have to talk about that. He may use emotional abuse. It's always a little bit harder to track this one. But, name calling's one, making her feel bad about herself, so destroying her self-esteem. calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. And that making her feel guilty is probably a big part of that. So like, look what you're making me do. I'm getting angry here. It's all your fault. And so there's that, I'm not taking responsibility, but I'm going to make you take responsibility for the abuse. And once you start hearing that language, like, oh, I made him angry, or I made the wrong meal and he got angry about that. And once you start hearing that, you know that that's a big part of emotional abuse that's occurring, and then you need to respond in the most appropriate ways for that. Using isolation, we sort of talked about that. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Now, in my group work experience, this happens quite a lot. It was just a push, Kevin, they would say to me. But as we unpack it, what I come to realize, or what truth comes out in the end, that it was a push that put her through the window, and put her in hospital, and she had all these stitches. So there's those sort of experience. So, Kevin, it was just a slap. Oh, okay. And when we get to the truth of the matter, it was a closed fist in the eye socket, fractured eye socket, put her in hospital. So men in these situations will minimize because it's embarrassing. It's a lot of shame for them that they've just beaten up their wife and they don't want to deal with it, but they have to deal with it. They have to take ownership. They have to be accountable. They have to be responsible for their violence. Using children, pretty self-explanatory. Male privilege, so treating her like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, being one to define men's and women's roles. So again, and it's just socialization. Again, it's about how we raise children, all that sort of thing. So I'm not going to focus too much. I think I've done a bit on that already. So using coercion and using threats and using economic abuse is really, really important. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the equality wheel. See, it's all lovely. So parent control, dark, horrible. Equality, all nice and lovely. I kind of like that. Because the link between parent control and equality is simply attitude of the perpetrator. So the reality is simply this: if we can work intensely around getting him to change his behaviour and thinking differently around his family, getting him to think differently around all the issues that he's encountering, then we can start educating around non-threatening behaviour. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What's the experience here? And so talking and acting so that she feels safe, comfortable in expressing herself and doing things. Now that sounds really good. We all want that for everybody, not just in a relationship, but all friendships and all things that we're connected to. We want people to feel okay and to be able to be themselves. Respect goes without saying. I don't think I need to go into that. Trust and support, so she can feel that she's supportive in looking after the kids, that she's supportive and trying to achieve her life ambitions, her dreams and her goals. Making her able to do those sort of things. Honesty and accountability, big part of it. Responsible parenting, shared responsibility, and economic partnership. That's all a part of it. That's the big part, is the attitude. If you're dealing with people who are willing to address their behaviour, it's about getting them to own it, getting them to be responsible for their violent behaviour. Cool. Next slide. Yep. So some questions that you might want to ask the perpetrator. So these are some of the things that you probably want to explore. And why you're asking these questions is you really, in light of all the information we're giving, if you're a newbie or you just start, or you have some experience but you'd like to know more about this, then you ask these questions simply out of these parent control and equality wheels, and just to find out where they are. I don't want you to make excuses for them. Oh, because he had a horrible childhood, blah. Okay, there's probably grounds to explore that. But essentially, it's attitude, because, like I said, how he behaves at home, he might not behave like that anywhere else. So it's a choice. It's not always angry or always violent or always. It's not always the case. And so these questions are lined up to help you filter through, hopefully, in that sense. So why have they come to see you now after all this time? So they've been married 10 years and finding out the motivation. Because I have to confess, it's a bit of a cynical point of view. Maybe I need to do some work on that myself. But I find that men only move when there's a crisis occurring. And so when things are hit boiling point or exploding point, that's when they realize, oh no, I've got to do something about this. And that's probably linked into a solution-focused mindset. Everything's going okay? Excellent. Something's not going okay. We need to fix it. So you've got to check in with motivation. If they're doing it just because it look good in front of the judge, it might need to be challenged. That might need some challenging. If they're doing it because it's, want to look like I'm doing the right thing, then we need to challenge that as well. The motivation we're looking for, I'm doing this because I don't like what I do. I'm not happy about that. I'm ashamed of my behaviour and I want to change it. That's the sort of motivation you're looking for. What would they like to do about it is the next question. So again, it's about, well, you're here and this is why you're here. So what is it that you want to look at? Do they see these behaviours as problematic for them? So underlining all these, the shadowing of all these is all the attitude. So you're checking in on all the attitude stuff. What does this man stand to lose or gain through addressing his behaviour in their intimate relationship? How is it affecting other relationships? How is it affecting with his mum and dad and her mum and dad and his friendships and workmates, her friends and her, all that sort of stuff, all these interconnected sort of relationships. What have they done about it in the past? So he might not have done anything. He might have tried to do counselling before. It might not have worked. He might have done a group process. Who knows? What has improved in the situation, or alternatively, what has made things worse? What needs to happen for things to be different? And that's a kicker. Because what needs to happen? Well, your attitude needs to change. Your approach to these matters needs to be in line, or the equality, the non-violent approach to things. Cool. I think we're almost at the end. Is there another slide? Yeah. Okay. So we want to validate and support the guy coming in. We don't want him to make him like, oh, you bad person, right? We want him to come in. We want to validate. Yep, we understand things are tough. Things are not okay, and we want to support you through the process. We want to educate and empower these guys because they have dreams, they have ambitions, and I'm sure most of the guys I speak to, most of them don't like what they do, and they're happy about making changes once they start owning the behaviour and have a good attitude. And once they start getting some knowledge and some empowerment, they start doing it, they start feeling good and start seeing the benefits of change. Assist in developing strategies, so, classic motivational interviewing or classic solution-focused approach always works well with men. And so if you could set some goals and be realistic with those goals and be realistic about what the nature of the circumstances that they're in. So there may be a restraining order. They may have separated. So the reality might be they may never get back together again. But the developing strategy, they might have to form a good enough relationship that he can still have access to the kids and maintain some sort of relationship for the sake of the kids. Who knows? And be realistic, yeah. So just be absolutely realistic around the nature of the offences that he has caused. So it is domestic violence. It is a criminal offence. It is violence, okay? And so we've got to be realistic that if he's been really, really violent, if he's been really violent towards his partner, then we've got to understand that it might not be okay for them to be together for a period of time, or the relationship might be over. And that's the realism that we need to work with. Any more slide points? All right, so there's just my referencing there. Feel free to do that. Cool. All right. I've kept it a little bit brief. So, but I just wanted scope for questions.
That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. I just forgot. I just realised.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Mate. Yep.
You there?
Yeah, I'm here. Are you there?
Yeah. I can hear. Okay.
So
Now we've got a couple of questions.
Yep.
That listeners have emailed in prior to the webinar. Now, Leslie asks, do abusers show any potential warning signs?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and and it's one that could go either way.
I think they're all pretty hard, just quietly.
You can do two things. You can profile the character of the person if you really wanted to, and if you're able to do so, and look at stages of their development and their behaviours, and that can always be a good predictor of what they might be like. But the best person to talk to about perpetrating violence is actually the victim, and he comes home and he has a set routine, or he comes home and he does this, he comes home and he does that. Because you've got to understand, it's not always going to be a violent encounter with domestic violence or family domestic violence. It is the power and control. It is the manipulation. It is the male privilege stuff as well. And so can we determine, when he's going to abuse again? I guess if a person is violent and uses violence, and I think there's some precursors that you could look for, and that is often linked to stresses, triggers, things that are going on in the home, financial stress, all that sort of stuff. But they're excuses, that's not taking responsibility. But if you want to look for the excuses in terms of the prelude to the violence, then those triggers may be things to look for. But usually, these patterns of behaviour have been entrenched in the individual for a long, long time, and not, last week he was a good guy and then suddenly he turns violent. No, these behaviours are pretty much been a part of that person's life for a while. And can you sort of pick it? Well, it's hard. Usually, like I said, only when it comes to crisis point that we start working at this end, and you have to go back and back and back and look for patterns of behaviour. Like you have to look at, maybe you can look at family of origin stuff. Maybe you can look at systems theory as well, of how the family systems play a part in the family and domestic violence. Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Tanya.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
What were you going to say? No, go.
I was going to say, if it sort of doesn't answer the question, you just ask it again. Email me if it doesn't, or just talk a little bit more to what you mean around that question, because it's a little bit hard to say, because no individual's the same. I'm sure you can appreciate that. So everyone's going to respond differently or do things differently, and so it really is a system theory and how that individual plays a part in the family system, and what role they have, and it really links into family of origin. So what's been culturally okay to do. So yelling and screaming, it might be culturally okay, but hitting might not be. And so if hitting becomes part of that, then what's changed in the family system? And that's the stuff you need to look for. It means you've got to unpack a lot of stuff in order to get to that answer to that question.
Now, Tanya asks, if an abuser abates with domestic violence, but emotional abuse continues, how do you walk the fine line of encouraging their efforts with their domestic violence while counselling the emotional abuse?
Okay.
They're hard questions.
It is a hard question, and it's one that counsellors, I think, in my experience, has always been one of the hardest things to do, is to, we get him to cease physical violence, but then still this emotional stuff comes through. But it really comes down to attitude. And, sometimes I even put this to the guys. If you love your wife, why do you do what you do? And so it's about, if the physical violence is ceasing, excellent. That's a good thing. And that needs to be recognised and validated, absolutely. But I would say to the person then, well, that's only half the job done. And then I'd be saying, this other stuff that you do, this other stuff, like, this emotional manipulation that you do all the time, or making her feel responsible, or making her feel guilty, that's just as bad psychologically as you actually hitting her. Are you aware of that? And educate. Go back to my questions, or go back to the process and start educating them and saying, look, when you say to her, you made me angry, that's actually shifting responsibility. You need to change what you're saying I am angry, and name it why you're angry, and get them to take responsibility for that. And so the fine line is a hard one, because you've got to be measured in how you do that. I appreciate that. But I would say then you still got to work with them to take ownership of their violence, or the way they treat the individual, according, like if you look at the equality wheel, that's what you want to go for. So how can then we make these changes and aim towards some resemblance of the equality wheel? Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, or gets you thinking anyway.
Yeah. Kevin's email is up on the screen if you need to ask further.
I know you got mine up there. Sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah, you got me. Okay, great. Send them to me.
And your mobile.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Turn it off.
Anyway, no, that's okay. That's okay. It'll only be all good stuff.
I'm sure.
And David also emailed in a question. Now, this is very, this is dealing with ethnicity and cultural sort of. It's a difficult one,
Thanks,
like the
mate.
last two. When working, when working with ethnic groups which are very new to the country, for example, refugees.
Yep.
How do you deal with a male who isn't letting up and the wife doesn't want to leave? Now, I can sort of understand the question because, um, yeah, I can imagine that you would see it with refugees,
Yeah, I
probably.
have to I have to say first up before I even attempt to answer the question is that I had very little experience working in refugee backgrounds. Saying that though,
Mm-hmm.
I have done a little bit of work in terms of working with refugee young people and worked
Mm-hmm.
closely with an organisation called Assets over here, who work solely with refugees or torture and trauma survivors and things like
So,
that.
Kevin, you're just breaking up.
Oh, sorry. So
Can you
I
hear me,
work with
Kevin?
them. Yep.
You just
Sorry.
broke up the last when you were saying the organisation that you did work for. Could you say that
Yeah,
again?
I didn't work for them, but I worked with them in terms of some projects, and they're called
Oh,
Assets,
okay.
and they work with
Oh,
refugee torture trauma survivors. And what I come to understand just from listening is that we are well. It's probably a little bit of a bunny trail here, but it's a good example of some things that I want to allude to. We we organised a program called Drumbeat, and we started playing drums with these kids. And one of the person made a comment, "Oh, these guys should be excellent drummers, and they should be able to play drums and stuff like that." And then one of the workers politely reminded him, saying, "These kids have grown up in a refugee camp, far removed from
mm,
their culture, say a Sudanese culture or a Congolese culture, or or wherever they come from, and these kids have no idea what it means to be part of that community, let alone part of this community." So we label them
mm,
Sudanese refugees, but most of these kids have grown up in refugee camps on borders, so they have no idea. So that was so in one way I'm trying to say is that often we're confronted with cultural difficulties. Say we're working with a Sudanese group, or we're working with an Aboriginal group, or whatever the case may be. What happens is that we can actually probably get stuck believing that what they're doing is cultural, and it might not be. And so it's really important that when we work with cultural groups, that we talk to cultural people about that. Like I said, I don't come from that sort of training, so I don't fully can't fully quantify the question, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But
mm.
essentially, is
Yeah.
this: as a counsellor, in our confidentiality agreement, our oaths of confidentiality that we have to sign to, is that if we believe a person is at harm, we have to act. We have to inform our supervisors, or if we're working in private practice, we have to inform the most appropriate authorities, especially if we believe that they're at harm or whatever, or we believe they're capable of doing harm. We have to act in accordance to our oaths of confidentiality and our ethics and our duty of care. So, even if it was a cultural issue, or whether it be a white person, if I felt in my counselling that the woman was at serious risk, I am obligated then to inform somebody that this woman is at risk from this person. And that's probably the only way I can answer that question, because I know that if we look at the religious aspects of it, there's a lot of misrepresentation with religion in terms of relationships. Christianity is often misrepresented as being a misogynist religion, but when you look at the theology and its context and certain scriptures and stuff, what you find, and I can talk for this because of my little bit of my expertise, what we find is that the Bible doesn't teach subservience, women subservient to men. No, it teaches equality that men and women are supposed to have for each other. It's religion that the political aspects of the religion that again, the male privilege, the male dominance has made women subservient. I've heard from Muslim women, just from interviews on television, and so again, it's not the greatest reference, but even in the Quran, domestic violence or violence against women is not tolerated. It's actually a cultural, socio-political, religious aspect. So again, it's really about, if you're confronted with this really complex situation, which it is, and I appreciate it, David, it's simply about, one, you've got to fulfill your oaths of confidentiality and your ethics around that, and secondly, engage with specialists who are trained or who can give you knowledge or train you in that area. But if the woman is at risk of being harmed, then maybe talking to your supervisor is probably the first thing you need to do. Yeah. Hopefully that clarifies my position anyway, and hopefully that gives you some direction with your question.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah. You're just breaking up a bit there, sorry.
There's questions. Oh, I was just saying, yeah, I hope it answers the questions as well. And it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. So, so thank you very much, Kevin, and to everyone who participated and will be getting the recording. And Kevin is actually going to be presenting another webinar with us. I can't think of the date actually, but it's in the future. on adolescence and bullying. So we'll look forward to that. In my diary, it's the 10th.
Okay.
Is that the same as you, Kevin? So it's a 10th. So we look forward to that one as well, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you, Kevin.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Cheers, mate. Thanks. See ya. Bye.